Jamal's shoes squeaked against the pavement as he dribbled his basketball down the street, his headphones blasting the latest track. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the quiet suburban neighborhood. The game with his friends had been good, and he was still riding the high of hitting the winning shot. As he walked, his mind drifted to what he would do when he got home: grab a quick shower, finish his homework, maybe even get in a few more minutes of practice in the driveway. But the sound of screeching tires behind him yanked him out of his thoughts. A police cruiser slowed to a crawl beside him, its tires crunching against the gravelly road. Jamal's heartbeat quickened. His mind raced for an explanation, but he hadn't done anything wrong. It had to be a misunderstanding. The car came to a full stop, and the door swung open with a metallic clunk. Jamal instinctively pulled out one earbud, turning to see a tall officer stepping out, his hand already resting on his belt. Jamal felt his stomach tighten. "Where you headed?" the officer asked, his voice cutting through the otherwise silent street. Jamal hesitated for a split second, trying to stay calm. "I'm just going home, sir," he replied, pointing down the road. The officer's eyes scanned Jamal from head to toe, lingering on his hoodie, basketball, and sneakers. "You live around here?" His tone wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Jamal's mouth went dry. He nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. Just a few blocks down." The officer stepped closer, narrowing his eyes. Jamal's skin prickled under the weight of his stare. It was as if the man was looking for something, anything to pin on him. "What's in the bag?" the officer asked, gesturing to Jamal's backpack. "Just my school stuff," Jamal answered, holding the straps a little tighter. His instincts told him this was going south fast, and he needed to stay cool. He wasn't looking for trouble. The officer's lips twisted into a thin smirk, his gaze hardening. Without warning, he grabbed the basketball out of Jamal's hands, turning it over as if expecting something to fall out of it. The small crowd of neighborhood residents that had gathered around from their porches watched silently. Jamal felt the heat of their stares and his skin tingled with humiliation. "This is your idea of going home?" the officer sneered, tossing the basketball back at Jamal's feet. The ball rolled away and Jamal stood frozen, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His mind screamed to do something, to say something, but fear held him still. Before he could respond, the officer's hand rested on his holster. "Got any ID on you, kid?" Jamal quickly nodded, fumbling through his backpack for his wallet. His fingers trembled as he handed it over. The officer took his time flipping through the contents, shaking his head as if this was some kind of joke. When he handed it back, the smirk was gone, replaced by a look of thinly veiled contempt. "You've got to be kidding me," the officer muttered. "What are you doing in a neighborhood like this anyway?" Jamal's chest tightened. "I live here," he repeated, his voice more firm now, though his hands still shook slightly. The officer leaned in, his face just inches from Jamal's. "You sure about that?" Jamal could feel his heart pounding in his ears. This wasn't right. None of this was right. He hadn't done anything wrong, and yet here he was, standing frozen on the street, feeling more and more trapped by the second. "I'm sure," Jamal said quietly, his voice steady, but barely above a whisper. The officer straightened up and stepped back, looking Jamal over again, then chuckled. "We'll see about that." Jamal watched as the officer took out his radio, muttering something Jamal couldn't quite make out. His legs felt weak, and for the first time, he seriously considered running. But where would he go? He knew that running would only make things worse. He needed to keep calm, needed to show that he wasn't a threat. "I'll need you to empty your bag," the officer said, more like a command than a request. Jamal's heart sank. He slowly knelt down and unzipped his backpack, pulling out his textbooks, notebooks, and his basketball jersey. He laid everything out on the sidewalk, trying to keep his hands steady. The officer stood over him, arms crossed, watching every move like a hawk. "That's it?" the officer asked, his tone mocking, as if daring Jamal to be hiding something. Jamal nodded, his eyes never leaving the ground. He could feel his throat tightening, his emotions beginning to get the better of him. He forced himself to take a deep breath. "Yes, sir. That's it." The officer crouched down, rifling through Jamal's belongings with zero care, tossing the books aside as if they were worthless. Jamal clenched his fists tighter, his nails digging into his palms. This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. This was something else. Something worse. The officer stood up, dusting off his hands as if he'd just done something unpleasant. "Well," he said, looking down at Jamal with a condescending smirk, "guess you're clean this time. But I'll be keeping an eye on you." Jamal's blood boiled, but he bit his tongue. He didn't dare say anything. "Not yet." "Now, why don't you pack your stuff and get out of here?" the officer said, as though he was doing Jamal a favor by letting him go. Jamal slowly began gathering his scattered belongings, his hands shaking. He could feel the eyes of the neighbors on him, judging him, and in that moment, he had never felt so small. As Jamal stood up to leave, the officer took a step forward, leaning in again. "You remember what I said? I'm watching you." Jamal nodded, too angry and too scared to respond with anything more. He just wanted to get out of there, to get home where he was safe. But as he turned to leave, the officer's voice cut through the air once more, freezing him in place. "Next time, I might not be so nice." Jamal swallowed hard and kept walking, his back stiff with tension, his heart racing. He didn't know what else to do but keep his head down and move as fast as he could. Jamal's mind raced as he walked away, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. The humiliation, the anger, the confusion, all of it swirled inside him, threatening to boil over. How had this happened? He hadn't done anything wrong. He had been minding his own business, heading home after a basketball game with his friends. Yet here he was, feeling like a criminal for simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or maybe it was just because of the color of his skin. He couldn't shake the look in the officer's eyes, the way he had scanned him, not seeing Jamal as a person, but as a threat. It was a look Jamal had seen before, though never this up close. He had heard stories from his father, from family friends, even from older kids at school. But this felt different. This was real. He had felt the weight of those stares, the weight of the accusation, and it sat heavy on his chest now, making it hard to breathe. Jamal didn't want to go straight home, not like this. He didn't want his mom to see him like this. She worried enough already, and the last thing he wanted was to add to her stress. His father, Marcus, was out of town on business, another big FBI case, like always. Normally, Jamal didn't mind. He was proud of his dad's job, proud of how much his father worked to keep people safe. But right now, he wished more than anything that his dad was here. As he continued walking, Jamal's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was his best friend, Malik. For a moment, Jamal considered answering, but he wasn't in the mood to talk about what just happened. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and kept moving, his mind still racing. He replayed the scene over and over in his head, trying to make sense of it, trying to figure out what he could have done differently. Maybe if he had been more polite, or if he hadn't looked so nervous, the officer wouldn't have treated him that way. But deep down, Jamal knew that wasn't true. It didn't matter what he had said or done. Grayson had made up his mind about him the moment he saw him. Jamal's thoughts shifted to his dad. What would his dad say if he knew? Marcus had always told Jamal to keep his cool in situations like this, to never escalate. Respect the badge, even when it doesn't respect you, his dad had said once, and Jamal had taken it to heart. He had followed his dad's advice today, keeping his head down, staying calm. But it didn't make the situation any easier to swallow. He wondered if he should call his dad. Maybe his dad would know what to do, how to make this all go away. But as he thought about it, Jamal realized he didn't want to worry him. His dad had enough on his plate with his job, and the last thing Jamal wanted was to add more stress. Besides, what could his dad do? Jamal was safe now. It was over. At least, that's what he tried to tell himself. But the sting of what had happened wouldn't go away. It clung to him, seeping into his bones, making him feel smaller with each step he took. He had never felt this powerless before, this stripped of his dignity. He had always been confident, always sure of himself. But now, for the first time, he felt like that confidence had been shattered. Jamal's mind flashed back to the moment Grayson had grabbed his basketball. The officer had looked at it like it was a foreign object, like it didn't belong in Jamal's hands. It was such a small gesture, but it had spoken volumes. To Grayson, Jamal wasn't just a kid walking home from a game. He was something to be suspicious of, something to be feared. He kept walking, his body moving on autopilot, not really knowing where he was going. He passed familiar streets, the houses of neighbors he'd known for years, but everything felt different now. The neighborhood, which had always felt safe, now felt alien. It was like the world had shifted in some subtle way, leaving Jamal standing on shaky ground. A part of him wanted to turn around, to march back to that spot and demand answers, to ask Grayson why he had treated him that way. But another part of him knew that wouldn't solve anything. If anything, it would only make things worse. He had seen enough videos online to know how quickly things could spiral out of control in situations like this. Jamal sighed, his breath shaky as he tried to collect himself. He had to let it go. That's what his dad would tell him to do. Don't carry the weight of the world on your shoulders, Marcus had said once. There's enough of that to go around. But how could he let it go when it felt so personal, so targeted? His phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Malik. Yo, you good? Jamal stared at the message for a long moment before typing back. Yeah, I'm good. It was a lie, but he didn't have the energy to explain what had happened. Not yet. Maybe later, when it didn't feel so raw, so heavy. As he approached his house, Jamal took a deep breath. His mom would be inside, probably making dinner, her mind occupied with the usual worries of the day. He didn't want her to see how shaken he was, didn't want her to ask questions. So, he squared his shoulders, forced a small smile onto his face, and stepped through the front door. The familiar warmth of home washed over him, but it did little to soothe the ache in his chest. His mom called out from the kitchen, asking how his day had been. Jamal's voice was steady as he answered, telling her it had been fine, nothing out of the ordinary. But as he headed to his room, his mind lingered on Grayson's parting words. Next time, I might not be so nice. Those words echoed in his head, haunting him as he shut the door behind him, leaned against the wall, and let out a shaky breath. How had it come to this? Jamal sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen as he scrolled through messages from his dad. He hadn't planned on telling him. Not yet. But the more he sat in the quiet of his room, the more the weight of the incident pressed down on him. He didn't know how to process it. He didn't know how to shake off the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. And in that moment, the only person he wanted to talk to was his dad. He swiped through his contacts, thumb pausing over his dad's name. Part of him didn't want to bring this up. He didn't want to admit that he had felt powerless, that the officer had made him feel so small. But another part of him knew that if anyone could understand, it would be Marcus. After all, his dad had spent years dealing with people who abused their authority. His job was to protect the vulnerable, to take down those who thought they could do whatever they wanted without consequence. With a deep breath, Jamal hit the call button. The phone rang a few times before his dad picked up. Hey, son. Everything okay? The sound of his dad's voice immediately brought a sense of relief, but it also made the lump in Jamal's throat grow tighter. He tried to keep his voice steady, tried not to sound too shaken. Hey, Dad. Something happened today. There was a pause on the other end, and Jamal could almost picture his dad sitting up straighter, his attention sharpening. What's going on, Jamal? Jamal took a deep breath and told him everything, about the police officer, about the questions, about the basketball, and about how the officer had looked at him like he didn't belong. He spoke quickly, the words tumbling out in a rush as he tried to explain how he had kept his cool, how he had done everything right, but still felt like he was being punished for something he couldn't control. His dad listened silently, not interrupting, just letting Jamal talk. When Jamal finished, there was a heavy silence on the line, and for a moment, Jamal wondered if he had said too much. Maybe he shouldn't have called. Maybe this would just make things worse. But then his dad spoke, his voice calm but laced with an undercurrent of anger. That officer crossed a line, Jamal. I'm proud of you for keeping your cool, but this isn't something you should have to go through. Not now, not ever. Jamal swallowed hard, his chest tightening. I didn't know what else to do, Dad. I didn't want to make it worse. You did the right thing, Marcus said firmly. But this isn't over. We're not letting this slide. Jamal blinked, surprised by the sudden determination in his dad's voice. What do you mean? I'm coming home tonight, his dad replied. We're going to handle this. That officer needs to be held accountable. Jamal felt a flicker of relief, but it was quickly overshadowed by doubt. Are you sure, Dad? I mean, I don't want to cause trouble. This isn't about causing trouble, Jamal. It's about standing up for what's right. No one has the right to treat you that way, and there need to be consequences. For the first time since the encounter with Officer Grayson, Jamal felt a sense of hope. His dad was coming home. His dad, the FBI agent who always knew what to do, was going to handle this. But even as relief washed over him, Jamal couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. What if this made things worse? What if Grayson retaliated somehow? He had already said he'd be watching Jamal. What if this escalated? Won't this just make him madder? Jamal asked quietly. Maybe, Marcus replied, his voice softening. But that's not something you need to worry about. You've done everything right. Now it's my turn to make sure this gets handled the way it should. Jamal nodded, though his dad couldn't see it. He trusted his dad. He always had. But the fear, the doubt, it still lingered. I'll be home in a few hours, Marcus continued. We'll talk more then. But I don't want you to worry, okay? I've got this. Okay, Dad, Jamal replied, his voice a little steadier now. Thanks. They said their goodbyes, and Jamal hung up, staring at the phone in his hand. He felt better, knowing his dad was coming home, but the weight of the day still hung heavy on him. He wasn't used to feeling like this, so vulnerable, so unsure of himself. Usually, he could shake things off, move past them. But this felt different. His mind raced as he thought about what his dad might do. Marcus had always been the calm, level-headed type, but Jamal could hear the anger in his voice. And when Marcus was angry, things happened. People got fired. Cases got closed. Justice got served. Jamal just hoped that justice wouldn't come with more problems attached. As he lay back on his bed, staring up at the ceiling, Jamal replayed the encounter with Grayson again and again in his mind. The way the officer had looked at him, the way he had smirked as if daring Jamal to say something, to fight back. It made Jamal's skin crawl just thinking about it. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but one thing was certain. Grayson had no idea who he was messing with. Marcus Johnson wasn't just any dad. He was an FBI agent, and he wasn't the kind of man to let something like this slide. Jamal's phone buzzed again. Another text from Malik. This time, Jamal answered. I'm good, he typed, his fingers moving quickly. But I might need your help soon. He wasn't sure what was going to happen in the coming days, but he knew one thing for sure, things were about to change. And whether Officer Grayson liked it or not, he was about to learn a lesson he wouldn't soon forget. A few hours later, Jamal was sitting in the living room, nervously tapping his fingers against the arm of the couch. His mom was in the kitchen, humming quietly as she prepared dinner. She had no idea what had happened earlier, and Jamal hadn't said a word. But soon, that was going to change. He could hear the sound of his dad's car pulling into the driveway, and his heart began to race. Marcus was home, and it was time to face everything head-on. The front door opened, and Jamal's dad stepped in, his expression calm but serious. Jamal stood up, feeling a mixture of relief and anxiety wash over him. His dad gave him a quick nod, acknowledging him, but there was no need for words just yet. Marcus set his briefcase down and made his way into the kitchen, where he exchanged a few quiet words with Jamal's mom. Jamal couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could tell by the way his mom's face changed that she now knew something was wrong. After a few moments, his dad motioned for him to come over, and they sat down together at the dining table. His mom joined them, her brow furrowed with concern. Jamal wasn't used to this kind of tension at home. Normally, his family was easygoing, filled with laughter. But now, the air felt heavy, as if everyone was waiting for the storm to break. Marcus spoke first, his voice steady and calm. "Jamal, I want you to tell your mom what happened today." Jamal shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but he nodded. He had already told his dad, but now he had to relive the whole thing again, this time with his mom. He recounted the story once more, the police officer, the accusations, the humiliation. His mom's face paled as she listened, her hands trembling slightly as she placed them on the table. By the time Jamal finished, the room was silent, and his mom's eyes were brimming with tears. "How could someone treat you like that?" she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "You're just a kid." Marcus reached over, placing a hand on his wife's. "We're going to handle this," he reassured her. "I've already called the precinct. I've spoken to some people, and they know I'm coming in tomorrow." Jamal's stomach dropped. He knew his dad meant business, but he hadn't realized just how serious this was going to get. His dad was going to confront the police directly. Marcus wasn't the kind of man to make empty threats, and Jamal knew that once his dad got involved, things were going to change. He just wasn't sure if he was ready for what came next. "Do you think it'll make a difference?" Jamal asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus turned to him, his expression firm. "It will. That officer crossed a line, and he's going to be held accountable. But Jamal, this isn't just about you. This is about making sure that this doesn't happen to anyone else." Jamal nodded, but inside, he felt conflicted. He understood what his dad was saying, but part of him just wanted to forget it all, to move on and pretend it never happened. He didn't want to become the center of attention, didn't want to stir up more trouble. But his dad had always taught him that standing up for what was right sometimes meant doing uncomfortable things, and Jamal knew this was one of those times. The next morning came quickly. Jamal barely slept the night before, his mind racing with thoughts of what would happen. His dad was up early, dressed in his suit, his FBI badge clipped to his belt. Jamal watched as his dad prepared for the day, his every movement precise, controlled. This wasn't just a father protecting his son. This was an FBI agent going to work. Before he left, Marcus turned to Jamal, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I need you to trust me, okay? This is going to be handled the right way. I know you're worried, but I'm going to make sure that officer answers for what he did." Jamal nodded, though he still felt a knot of anxiety in his chest. He trusted his dad, but the idea of facing the police, of possibly seeing Officer Grayson again, made him feel uneasy. What if Grayson denied everything? What if this just made things worse? The day dragged on, every minute feeling like an hour. Jamal stayed home from school, unable to focus on anything. He tried watching TV, playing video games, even shooting hoops in the driveway, but nothing could take his mind off what was happening. His mom was quiet too, her worry etched into every line of her face. They both jumped when they finally heard the sound of Marcus's car pulling back into the driveway. Jamal's dad walked in, his face unreadable. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest as he waited for his dad to say something. Finally, Marcus spoke. "The precinct took this seriously," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Officer Grayson has been put on administrative leave pending an investigation. They've already pulled his body cam footage, and from what I saw, it's clear he was out of line." Jamal felt a wave of relief wash over him, but there was still a lingering sense of unease. "What happens now?" "Now the department will conduct a full review," Marcus replied. "And we'll keep pushing to make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug. I've also filed a formal complaint. They know who I am, and they know that this isn't going away." Jamal nodded slowly, the tension in his body easing slightly. His dad had done it. He had stepped in and made sure that Grayson would be held accountable. But even with that victory, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed inside him. The fear, the anger, it wasn't gone. He had stood up to injustice, but he knew that it wouldn't be the last time he faced something like this. Later that night, after dinner, Jamal sat with his dad in the living room. They didn't talk much, just sat in the quiet, watching the flicker of the TV. But as they sat there, Jamal realized something important. His dad had taught him more than just how to handle this one situation. He had shown Jamal that sometimes, the fight for justice was ongoing, that it wasn't always about winning or losing. It was about making sure that you didn't let the world make you feel small. Jamal wasn't sure what the future held or if Grayson would face the consequences he deserved. But he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't alone in this fight. His dad had his back, and together, they would make sure that things changed, no matter how long it took.